Hello, you're listening to episode 56 of the Drawing the Ideal Self podcast. I thought it would be useful to go over the theory of PCP in the way that Kelly set it out. So I'm going to do that over a few episodes, and today's episode is going to be about the fundamental postulate, which is really the basis for the rest of the theory. So the reference I'm using is a small book by Kelly, A Theory of Personality, The Psychology of Personal Constructs. So this little book is a good introduction, really, if you want to get into PCP and you don't want to have the outlay of the very expensive 2 volumes. I'm not saying don't buy them, because they are really good and you will have a comprehensive understanding. But this book will be good to get you started. The other book that would be useful is the Coventry Constructivist Centre book, which is the Foundation Guide. So we have a foundation course in PCP, and this is the book that goes with the course. It's designed to be read as material in advance of the course session, but it does again provide a summary. I'll put the references for both in the show notes. So the first thing I had to do when I came to PCP is find out what on earth a fundamental postulate was. So my academic training didn't train me very well for that, and I had to go and look it up. What Kelly says about a fundamental postulate is this: a postulate is, of course, an assumption, but it is an assumption so basic in nature that it antecedes everything which is said in the logical system which it supports. He acknowledges that somebody else might decide this isn't a fundamental postulate because we are able to question any truth of things. And this fits entirely with PCP theory, that we accept the theory or not, and we can reject it and have our own theory. And Kelly was always fine with that. And he says, a statement, therefore, is a postulate only if we accord it that statement. If we bring the statement into dispute, as well we may in some other instances, we must recognise we are then arguing from other postulates either explicitly stated or more likely implicitly believed. Thus, in scientific reasoning, nothing antecedes the postulate, as long as it is a postulate. And the truth of a statement is never questioned as long as that statement is in use as a postulate. What we have really said, then, is this: let us suppose, for the sake of discussion which is to follow, that a person's processes are psychologically channelized by the ways in which he anticipates events. Let it be clearly understood that we are not proposing this postulate as an ultimate statement of truth. In modern scientific thought, it is always customary to accept even one's postulates as tentative or ad interim statements of truth, and then to see what follows. So the fundamental postulate that Kelly proposed is: a person's processes are psychologically channelized by the ways in which he anticipates events. And bear in mind that his original theory was written in the 1950s, which used the male pronoun as the way to do academic writing. Obviously we don't do that anymore in the same way, so please bear that in mind and don't be offended, because it was the tradition at the time. So what Kelly said is that, first of all, we need to think about what a postulate is. So what he means by it is that it's an assumption, and he says it's an assumption so basic in nature that it antecedes everything which is said in the logical system it supports. And he does not propose it as what he calls an ultimate statement of truth, because he's got a scientific bent, and he is aware that a statement like that would be challenged, also that it needs to have evidence in life and in the way people do work. If you're going to propose that people work in particular ways, you should be able to do something to confirm that that is the case, which is where the repertory came in. So Kelly goes on to break down his own fundamental postulate. So he takes all the terms in a person's processes are psychologically channelized by the ways in which he anticipates events. He obviously worked hard on this postulate because he then goes on to break down what he means by the words in it. So the first thing is what he meant by a person, and he used that term to indicate that this is an individual person rather than any part of the person, any group of persons, or any particular process manifested in the person's behaviour. So that's quite a holistic view of a person. And his first consideration, he says, is an individual. And we know that PCP is really good at drawing out individual, unique ways of understanding the world. So in this postulate, he's saying that his theory is about people and how they are. And this is important. This isn't a theory of therapy. The work about therapy is how the theory applies to therapy. So it is a universal psychology of people rather than a psychology that's to do with the way a particular kind of psychological intervention might work. He goes on to talk about processes, and he explains that he means that the person's construing and experiences of life are constantly on the move. They're always developing, they're always changing. He goes on to say, for our purposes, the person is not an object which is temporarily in a moving state, but is himself a form of motion. So within that is the change that people experience in themselves in relation to the experiences that they have. Change in your construing system, development of new constructs, deleting, if you like, constructs that no longer serve much purpose to us, elaborating constructs, working out how things fit together in terms of a construing system. All of that is motion. And it's a nice acknowledgement, in my view, of the way people interact with the world, which leads to changes in the way they see the world and the way they see themselves. The important thing is constant motion. So that means that we don't have personality traits which are stuck and can never be changed. Now, that view has been challenged more recently within psychology, but at the time he was writing, there were lots of ideas of people are like this and stay like this. The next word he draws attention to is psychologically. And remember, it was psychologically channelized. By using the term psychologically, he's saying, that this is a limit. This is what we're interested in. There's some overlaps with other things, and he points out sociology. But basically, this theory is about psychology and the way people interact with their experiences. He says, a person's processes are what they are, and psychology, physiology, or what have you, are simply systems concocted for trying to anticipate them. Thus, when we use the term psychologically, we mean that we are conceptualizing processes in a psychological manner, not that the processes are psychological, rather than something else. So this is drawing attention to the fact that this is a psychological theory. It's not a physiological theory. It's not a sociological theory. It lies within the realm of psychology. So he says, psychology refers to a group of systems for explaining behaviour, all of which seem to offer similar coverage. Thus, when we identify our system as psychological, we are loosely identifying it with certain other systems because it has a similar realm and range of convenience. He says he didn't see any point in trying to define the boundaries of psychology because the things that are psychologically understood can also be understood in other ways. So sociology would be a close cousin of psychology, in my opinion. So we can understand why we need to care for people in care homes and what we need to do about the people there, either from a psychological point of view, a sociological point of view, an economic point of view. But all those theories are, in their separate realms. And here he's concerned with psychological theory. They can all have overlaps, and a bit like a Venn diagram, we might have some that are more connected than others to certain things. So he's not saying this is the only way to understand it. He's saying this is a psychological theory which is about people, and there are others that can coexist, and that's okay. So just a refresh of the fundamental postulate is a person's processes are psychologically channelized by the ways in which he anticipates events. And he has a nice way of explaining what he means by channelized. He says, we conceive a person's processes as operating through a network of pathways rather than as fluttering about in a vast emptiness. The network is flexible and is frequently modified, but it is structured, and it both facilitates and restricts a person's range of action. So basically, our construing system is a thing that offers the structure, but the experiences are of the world and in reality, and the way we use our construing system is to understand and anticipate what's coming and how things may be understood. Without a system, it becomes very, very loose, and we've talked before on this podcast about what happens if you have too many loose construings of an experience. Then it's hard for people to come together and understand each other, but it's also hard for you to maintain a way of understanding that experience across time and repeated events. He then goes on to say about the word ways. So he says, the channels are established as means to ends. They are laid down by the devices which a person invents in order to achieve a purpose. A person's processes, psychologically speaking, slip into the grooves which are cut out by the mechanisms he adopts for realising his objectives. So if you take something mundane like deciding that you need a new pair of trousers, then the first thing that you might do is to have a consideration of cost. This is one of the ways in which you're construing the purchase of trousers. You wouldn't have a pair that were £400, for instance, if you don't have very much money. So immediately, money is part of the construing of trousers. And you can see that those two things are going to be linked. So when we're looking at trousers, before we think of other things maybe, we'd be thinking, do they fit into my price bracket? If they fit into my price bracket, what are the shops that might sell them? Where am I going to go shopping and not be horrified by what happens when I go to the till? So if we're construing the world as finances matter and are relevant to us, then we'll take that into account when we're doing our shopping. So that's one of the ways that we would channelise our experiences. So we'll have some constructs that are related to finances perhaps, and then we might get into style of trouser and what we're going to wear them for and how that's related to what we might purchase. So we've got a network of constructs which will come into play when we buy the trousers. The searching for trousers will mean that we look in particular places and we ignore others. So we're taking that construing into everyday life. And we will then, at some point, decide whether or not they suit us. And whether they suit us is related to how we want to be seen by others, about how they feel on our body, about what we're buying them for. So if you're buying them for an interview, that might be very different than if you're buying them to work on your garden. So the ways in which we use our construct system will need to have that structure. Otherwise, we won't be able to make decisions very easily. The next word he draws attention to is he. Now, remember, we would mean he, she, they, so he did not mean men only. So he says, our emphasis is upon the way in which the individual man chooses to operate, rather than upon the way in which the operation might ideally be carried out. Each person may erect and utilise different ways, and it is the way he chooses which channelise his processes. So that's drawing attention back to the individual, that this is that individual's personal construing of themselves and of the world that leads to the way they act, the way they behave, and to what happens in terms of what they're going to anticipate in the situation that they're in. The next word is anticipate, and he says, here is where we build into our theory its predictive and motivational features. Like the prototype of the scientist that he is, man seeks prediction. His structured network of pathways lead toward the future, so that he may anticipate it. This is the function it serves, anticipation is both the push and pull of the psychology of personal constructs. It's important to remember that anticipation is going on, whether or not we notice it. It just is. So we are sometimes very aware of our anticipations. So if we go to a new place, supposing we stay in a hotel, if we don't know the layout, we've not been there before, we don't know where it is in the city that we're staying in, there's a lot of anticipations that we are aware of, because when we get there we think, oh, I didn't think it would be like this, or yes, it's exactly what I expected, or no, it doesn't quite fit. So those anticipations are going on all of the time. Usually they work reasonably well. So you can anticipate when you go into an office that there are going to be desks, chairs, computers. If it was an office without all those things, then that would be in contrast to the usual construing of office, and we would then have to find some new way either of elaborating and extending our construct of office so that it can be included, or to find a new word that we don't call it an office, we call it something else. And that new word is a summary of our construing. So I remember seeing images of the Google building where people were roller skating and had really comfortable seats and little pods to go and think in. It's nothing like my office at work. I wish it was, but it isn't like that. And that really extended my idea of what an office could be. So these anticipations are going on, and that's crucial to the theory. The next thing he talks about is events. And he says, man ultimately seeks to anticipate real events. This is where we see psychological processes as tied down to reality. Anticipation is not merely carried out for its own sake. It is carried on so that the future reality may be better represented. It is the future which tantalizes man, not the past. Always he reaches out to the future through the window of the present. And I think for the time this was a really different idea, that what Kelly was not saying is that your future is determined by your past and that is entirely predictable. And we know now, from lots of work in psychology and sociology and all the allied disciplines, that actually that isn't the case. If you looked at a version of something like behaviourism, you would be expecting that unless there was a reward present that could be identified, that someone wouldn't be willing to do something. Well, what psychology of personal construct says, hold on a minute, it's a bit more complicated than that. And people do things that at one level are not in their best interests. They will behave in ways that seem at odds with what would be sensible in that situation. And I think this is what first got me interested in PCP, because I was working in a special school and I was thinking about the children there and thinking, I wonder why they do these things. They keep getting into trouble. How does it make sense? What is going on that means that they are still doing things and they're not learning despite high levels of reward that were going on for things that were more appropriate? And that brought me really to a moment where PCP came into my life at just a really timely point. So it's always made sense to me. And I think that's, to me, it's the greatest benefit of PCP, is it can be used to think about all kinds of behaviour without a judgment, either by society or by ethics, of whether something is right or wrong. You can separate it a little from that. We may still have very strong ethics and views about what's right and wrong. It doesn't stop us doing that. But what it does do is allows us to understand and really put ourselves in somebody else's shoes. So just a reminder then, the fundamental postulate is what the rest of the theory is built upon, and the corollaries and all the other things in PCP come after this. So this is like a building block at the very centre, a keystone perhaps, that everything else is built upon. And a reminder of what it is really a summary of what PCP is about and what the theory says, which is that a person's processes are psychologically channelized by the ways in which he anticipates events. And Kelly summarises thus: we now have a statement of a fundamental postulate. Perhaps there can spring from it a theory of personality with movement as a phenomenon rather than the epiphenomenon, with the psychological processes of the layman making the same sense as those of the scientist. A dynamic psychology without the trappings of animism, a perceptual psychology without passivity, a behaviorism in which the behaving person is credited with having some sense, a learning theory in which learning is considered so universal that it appears in the postulate rather than as a special class of phenomena, a motivational theory in which man is neither pricked into action by the sharp points of stimuli nor dyed with the deep tones of hedonism, and a view of personality which permits psychotherapy to appear both lawful and plausible. Let us call this theory the psychology of personal constructs. I know that this episode might not be to everybody's taste, but maybe it's something that you can come back to if you decide to go further into PCP. If you're not interested at the moment, don't dismiss it as never needing to know what the theory is built on, because this is the keystone. I suppose it's a bit like laying out your stall. Here's my psychological theory of how people operate. And they operate at an individual level with their individual understandings. Doesn't mean they can't have shared construing with other people, but in the end, we're talking about individual people. Okay, so I hope that you will have found that useful, particularly if you are doing anything that means you're studying the theory, because it's helpful to have a number of different explanations, I think, and going back to Kelly from time to time is essential. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you again next month.